Hey guys, so today we're going to be going over our fourth biogeochemical cycle, the phosphorus cycle. You will see that this one overlaps a little bit with the nitrogen cycle once we get to the human impacts on the phosphorus cycle. So with the phosphorus cycle, just like with our other biogeochemical cycles, we're going to be looking at the different processes. You do need to be able to identify those different processes given a description or an image, and just kind of describe what's happening in each one. And then of course, we're going to finish off by looking at the human impacts on the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is really important because phosphorus is one of the elements that are used in cell membranes. If you remember back to Science 10, we talk about the phospholipid bilayer, phospho referring to the phosphorus part. Nucleotides, which are the building blocks of DNA, also contain phosphorus in the backbone. And then calcium phosphate is also found in your bones. Calcium is converted into numerous different compounds as it moves through the phosphorus cycle. And unlike the other biogeochemical cycles that we've looked at, the phosphorus cycle does not include a gaseous phase. So there is no atmospheric phosphorus. The atmosphere is just not a reservoir for phosphorus. Instead, it's going to be stored in the lithosphere, in both the rock and the soil, in the hydrosphere, and in living things. So these are the different processes that you're going to have to be able to describe. So assimilation, decomposition, weathering, runoff, leaching, sedimentation, and geological uplift. These images are not anything that you have to have memorized. This is just what a nitrogenous base looks like. We looked at this also when we were doing the nitrogen cycle. Because as you can see, there's a lot of nitrogen in a nitrogenous base, but you also have the phosphate on the other end of it. And then this is a little piece of a cell membrane. This is the phospholipid bilayer. This is a phospholipid, and the head part of the phospholipid is where the phosphate is. So phosphorus is found in the soil in the form of phosphates, just like nitrogen in the soil is nitrates. These phosphates can be taken into plants through their roots. That process is called assimilation. Anytime a nutrient, whether it's carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus, anytime it is going into a living thing, we call that assimilation. That phosphorus can then be used to make cell membranes and nucleic acid, which is like the DNA or RNA in plants. And then when those plants are eaten, that phosphorus can then be used by the consumers as well. So that is also assimilation when the phosphorus goes from a plant to a consumer, or from, say, a primary consumer to a secondary consumer. Anytime an animal releases its waste products like urine or feces, that phosphorus is released back into the soil. And then decomposition is when dead plants and animals decompose. That also releases their phosphorus back to the soil. Weathering is another process along with decomposition that moves phosphorus into the soil. The largest reservoir of phosphorus is sedimentary rock. And anytime that rock is worn away by either wind or rain, that rock gets broken down and releases some of the stored phosphorus into the surrounding soil. That process is called weathering, the weathering away of the sedimentary rock to release the phosphorus into the soil. And then rain and running water like streams and stuff like that result in a process called runoff, which is where the phosphorus, which is still attached to the soil particles, gets carried down the body of water until it reaches a larger body of water like a lake, ocean, pond, that sort of thing. Phosphorus can also leach into groundwater or surrounding bodies of water like lakes and stuff like that from the soil through a process called leaching. Both runoff and leaching move phosphorus from the soil to the hydrosphere. Phosphorus from runoff and other sources can then build up on the bottom of large bodies of water. calcium phosphate from decomposing shelled organisms can also then form a layer on the bottom of the lake or the ocean, and that buildup of sediment, whether it be phosphorus from like shells or from soil that has run off into a larger body of water, all of that builds up on the bottom of the lake or ocean in the through the process of sedimentation. And then over time, that sediment is compacted and pressed together just by the weight of the water over top of it. And that's how we form sedimentary rock. That's why sedimentary rock has so much phosphate in it. And then the last process is geologic uplift, which causes sedimentary rock to gradually be lifted up from the bottom of the ocean or whatever until it is no longer underwater and it's now exposed to the elements, and then the weathering can occur, and then the weathering moves the phosphates from the sedimentary rock into the soil, and then the runoff carries it back to the ocean or the lake or whatever, and then it builds up because of sedimentation, and then this whole little process. So this is an example of what the phosphorus cycle might look like. So we have some leaching happening here, where the phosphates in the soil are going into the hydrosphere. You would also have some assimilation happening right here. You have assimilation happening here. You have rocks being worn away in the process of weathering. Yeah, this is an even better diagram because it shows some of the different cycles. There's really kind of like, I mean, it's all connected, but there's kind of like two different cycles happening. There's the one that involves living things, and the one that involves like the weathering sedimentation process over here. Just ignore this really terrible drawing that I did in the middle. I was trying to cover up a tractor that had nothing to do with the picture. So based on all of the different descriptions that we've talked about, you can try and fill this in. The answers are going to be on the next slide. So this is what it should look like. Of course, anytime we have phosphates moving into a living thing, like moving into plants, that is assimilation. Also, when those plants are eaten by animals, that's also assimilation. And then when those plants die, or when those animals die and decompose, that moves the phosphates back into the soil. Phosphates, so that's kind of the first little cycle, the assimilation and then decomposition, just moving phosphates between the soil and living things. Those phosphates in the soil can also leach directly into a body of water and then fall to the bottom, which is how we connect to the other kind of cycle within the phosphorus cycle. So you have these mountains in this case, which is just our reference of sedimentary rock that is exposed to the weather. And so the weather, like the wind and the rain, is going to wear away those sedimentary rocks. So that weathering process is going to move the phosphates from the rock into the surrounding soil. And then as this stream runs down this valley or whatever, it's going to carry that soil, still containing the phosphates, to a larger body of water. So that is the runoff process. It carries the soil containing the phosphates to a larger body of water. And then once the phosphates get to that larger body of water, the soil sinks, again with the phosphates, and builds up at the bottom of that body of water. That is the sedimentation process, that buildup of the soil containing the phosphates and the shells containing the phosphates at the bottom of the body of water. And then over time, that sedimentation is compacted into sedimentary rock. And then the last process is over hundreds of thousands of years, that lake bed or seabed or whatever is slowly going to be lifted up through the process of geologic uplift until it is once again exposed to the weather, and that little process can continue again. Okay, so that's it for the cycle. Let's look at some of the human impacts on it. Just like with the nitrogen cycle, the use of fertilizer has a big impact on the phosphorus cycle because fertilizers contain both nitrogen and phosphorus. So excess phosphorus tends to end up in the hydrosphere because of runoff carrying fertilizers to the water or leaching of fertilizers into groundwater and stuff like that. And just like with excess nitrogen, having too much phosphorus in your water can lead to algal blooms, which, as we talked about, when that algae dies and decomposes, the decomposers use up all of the oxygen that's present, and fish and stuff like that tend to suffocate. Deforestation also impacts the phosphorus cycle by increasing the rate of weathering, essentially, as well as runoff, because trees protect the ground underneath them from both weathering and runoff. The canopy protects the ground underneath from the weathering. The roots tend to be really good at holding the soil in place, so it prevents against runoff. And so when you deforest an area, both of those processes speed up. That can result in the soil that's left behind being low in nutrients and not very productive. And then the water that all of those phosphorus molecules got carried to now has too much phosphorus. And then poor agriculture can also decrease phosphorus availability in the soil because crops assimilate the phosphorus from the soil into themselves. And then when we take those crops away and don't let them decompose there, the phosphorus doesn't get returned to the soil. Okay, that's it for the phosphorus cycle. The water cycle is the only one that we have left. That's the one we'll be doing next.